Hi and welcome to JIC History. Today we'll talk about Locusta of Gaul, Emperor Nero's favourite poison maker, as well as one of the first documented serial killers throughout all of history. Her story is truly fascinating and I really hope you enjoy, and thank you so much for watching. Throughout all of history, poison was the silent killer of choice. Kings and emperors could fall victim to it just as easily as an unsuspecting servant could. Throughout the years, poisoners were a key part of many internal courts around the world. This is especially true for ancient Rome, where assassination was deeply feared. The previous two emperors were killed by those closest to them, Tiberius and Caligula. During this time, herbalists were employed to create the deadliest poisons they could create in order to get rid of enemies and competitors for their hiring clients. The poisoner we're discussing today has gone down in infamy as being one of the most prolific killers of our time period. She was the prized poison maker for Emperor Nero himself. She went from the wild woods of Gaul all the way to the marble courts of Rome, using her power to create allies and kill people in order to get to where she desired. She went from a slave to a highly prized poison maker for Emperor Nero himself. Her life is truly dangerous, and she killed many lives with her deadly poisons, as well as we learned a lot about poisons today from her notes and her work. But until then, let's look into her past. We believe Locusta was born in the late years of Augustus, or the early years of Tiberius. During this time period, Gaul was a territory of Rome, and this probably would have affected her life a little bit at the time period, but it's probably believed that she was raised in a small village in Gaul. This is because of her knowledge of herbalism. Now at the time, in rural areas, it was a traditional must for all people of Gaul to know basic characteristics of the plants around them, which ones are harmful, which ones are healing, and how best to use them for your intended purpose. Now Locusta probably was pretty good at this from the get-go, as we believe she quickly started out selling small antidotes and poisons to local people in her area to make money. It's believed Locusta first arrived in Rome in the late 40s AD. This is when Claudius was still on the throne. At this time, Rome was an evolving city, still recovering from the reign of the previous two emperors, Caligula and Tiberius. They were both assassinated people closest to them due to their dastardly reign. At this time, Rome was a cesspool of violence and misfortune, with cases like theft, violence, and even murder being commonplace. This is a perfect environment for someone like Locusta to take advantage, and she quickly put her deadly knowledge to practice, creating small poisons and antidotes for people around her. This built up a pretty affluent clientele pretty quickly, as she was very knowledgeable in this craft, and poison making was in high demand in the courts of Rome. Sadly, the details are lost to history, but many historians believe Locusta was arrested at least once for child murder and poisoning, but she was quickly released due to a high clientele getting her out. It is believed at the time when Locusta was released from prison is when she met Agrippina the Younger. Now, who is Agrippina the Younger? She is the previously exiled and new wife to Claudius. She is also a very prominent woman in Roman history in her own right. She is a niece to Tiberius as well as Claudius, who is, yes, also her husband. It is a bit gross, but it's a different time period, so we're just going to ignore the incest part. She is also the mother to the soon-to-be Emperor Nero. Now, she was previously exiled for trying to assassinate her brother Caligula. Why did she want to assassinate her brother? It's quite simple. Caligula's behaviour was getting very erratic and he was quite arrogant, and this alienated the Senate, and the Senate really didn't like him as he was just basically going crazy. He would write really small laws on these tiny bits of paper, and he would stick them to the roof of the Senate and expect them all to follow these laws. As you can imagine, the Senate, as well as his sisters Agrippina and Livilla, found this very tiresome and hard to control. And both Agrippina and Livilla wanted someone they could control in the Senate, as their power as females were quickly tied to the men close to their lives. So if they couldn't control Caligula, it meant they couldn't control their own power in the Senate, and they couldn't control their own power in the patriarchy. How Agrippina planned to solve this was to make her own brother-in-law, Lepidus, the new emperor, as he was one, married to a royal, so therefore he had pretty good ties, but he was also their cousin, so therefore he had strong ties in that regard as well. He was also much easier to manipulate and much more liked by the Senate. With a lot of Senate backing, they attempted to assassinate Caligula, but this plan didn't really get off the ground, as they were quickly overheard by one of Caligula's men and promptly taken down. Now, Lepidus himself was assassinated, but Caligula didn't kill his own sisters, as instead he exiled Livilla as well as Agrippina for adultery. He also had all their property and most of their power seized. So when Caligula passed away and Agrippina came back to Rome, she didn't have nearly as much power and leverage as she used to have. And that really freaked her out, and she quickly tried to get that power back. If you'd like to hear more about Agrippina's story, which is also a really cool story from ancient Rome, I'd really recommend watching my video on Agrippina that I'll soon be uploading, and I'll also have linked in the description below. But let's get back to how this relates to Locusta. Now, how Agrippina tried to get power back was she married her uncle Claudius. But Claudius was quite intelligent and she didn't feel like she had the level of power she would like. Instead, she wanted her own son Nero to be on the throne, as she felt she had better control over Nero's actions and therefore could probably use him like a shadow emperor. First, she had to get 1, Claudius named Nero his heir, and 2, get rid of Claudius as well as his natural born son Britannicus, who at the time period was only around 9 to 12 years old. Now, how Agrippina planned to meet these goals was through Locusta. She wanted Locusta to get rid of both Claudius and Britannicus. Now, one positive I can say about Agrippina is she was very cunning and she was very good with her words. She quickly turned the Senate against Claudius, even his closest men, as well as the Imperial Guard, whose sole job is to look after the emperor. It takes quite a decent amount of manipulation to turn people's sole job, who is to look after the emperor, against the emperor. Now, with the Senate as well as Agrippina encouraging him to make Nero his heir, as Britannicus was quite young at the time period, only 9 to 12 years old, he quickly names Nero his heir just until Britannicus is older. But Agrippina does not give him the chance. As soon as he names Nero his heir, she's quick to get Locusta to assassinate him. Now, how they wanted to do it was kind of subtly. Now, when she went to Locusta to get a poison to kill him, Locusta had a cunning idea. It is believed they killed him using the deadly white cat mushroom, or the death cat mushroom as it's also called. Now, they chose this because Claudius' favourite food himself was mushrooms, and he had it in nearly every meal. What Locusta did is she got the deadly death cat mushroom and handed it to the cook. They cooked it up for him and served it to him. But this only made him quite sick. Agrippina was even able to turn his own food taster, Helotus, against him. Now, when Helotus tasted the food, it was fine because death cat mushrooms aren't really very poisonous in small doses, so his one mouthful wouldn't have killed him. This is how we believe he was killed. We don't actually know for certain, as a lot of the details have been lost to history. But Claudius had the full plate, and therefore he got really sick. But his death was drawn out. But many people didn't really question this because Claudius wasn't really the ideal emperor. And this is partially why Agrippina was able to turn the Senate and the people against him. Whereas most emperors they idolize were heroic, young, battle-ready, have experience in the military, Claudius was none of those things. When he came to the throne, he was middle-aged. We now believe he probably had cerebral palsy or epilepsy. He had a limp, he had a stutter. His own family said he was a monster of a man because of his faults. They didn't really view his intelligence as even a strength, as he was viewed more like an all-day nerd instead of actual leader. And using this, Agrippina was also not only able to turn the Senate against him, but explain why he was so sick. No one really batted an eye when he was so sick because he had a history of being really sick. So Agrippina was able to poison him and he got really sick for a long period of time, but he wasn't dying. And that was a huge problem for Agrippina because he was holding on strong. But this was not really a big problem because Locusta had a backup plan. It is believed they got a doctor's feather and dipped it in deadly nightshade. Why'd they do this? Well, back in those days, when somebody was sick because they ate too much or they believed the food had gone bad, they'd tickle the back of their throat and vomit, and this is how they cured a lot of food-related illnesses. So when Claudius felt sick, he merely ordered his doctor to tickle the back of his throat so he would throw up. This was Claudius' death sentence, as the deadly nightshade had ingested into his stomach and mixed with death cat mushrooms, and this was a lethal dose, and he quickly died that night. Now, after the death of Claudius, people wanted answers because even though he was middle-aged and sickly, people were still kind of curious. And Agrippina had Locusta arrested, but their use of Locusta wasn't over yet. Nero ascended to the throne quickly afterwards, barely wasting a week. And after he ascended to the throne, they wanted Britannicus gone. At this point, Britannicus was believed to be 11 to 12, and when he got older, he would have very strong right to the throne, and they didn't want to lose that power. How they planned to do this is they pardoned Locusta of Claudius's death and they brought her back to kill Britannicus. But the first poisoning of Britannicus didn't work, even though at the time Britannicus wasn't even a teenager yet. But Emperor Nero and Agrippina knew that as soon as he got old enough, he would have very strong legitimacy to the throne, potentially even stronger than Nero himself, as Britannicus was Claudius's natural-born son. Now, how did they plan to do this? Once they had Locusta out of prison, they employed her to kill him as swiftly as possible. They believed she did this with arsenic, henbane, or yew extract. Most historians do believe, though, that it was just arsenic. But the first poisoning wasn't strong enough. They didn't give her a high enough dosage, as Locusta wasn't really as well versed in killing children, as most of the people she had killed with her poisons in the past were full-grown men, and therefore when she cut down the usage, she minimized its effects. Now, why didn't she go for the full usage? When you have too much arsenic in your system, it definitely shows on your liver as well as on your complexion. They didn't really want to risk in case they decided to cut him up to figure out why he died. It was easier for them to explain away Claudius's death because he was older and known to be quite sickly. And while similar, Britannicus was known to be quite sickly, as they believe nowadays he probably had epilepsy, he was still only young, and the epilepsy wasn't very prevalent. He only had a few seizures every so often. So they had to make it look as natural as possible. Now, when the poisoning failed, Nero was furious. He was known for having quite a bad temper, as I'm sure you've heard about through history. And he personally flogged Locusta for her failure. After this, he didn't want to go softly, because previously he wanted Britannicus dead, but in a subtle way, so it didn't seem so obvious. But after this, Nero did not care about how subtle the death of Britannicus looked. Using his power as emperor, he had slaves, children, as well as animals sent to Locusta to test his poisons on. He mainly used children slaves and children convicts, around the similar age as Britannicus, meaning they were probably from the ages of 8 till 12. And he hired Locusta to test the poisons on them in front of him. If the poison was too weak, or a child died too slowly, or died too heinously, they would retry, and they kept testing these poisons on these kids. We don't know how many kids died this way, but if this is proven to be true, it definitely means Locusta was one of the most prolific serial killers of her time period and one of the first documented serial killers. As soon as they found the right mix of what is believed to be the deadly nightshade, the same poison they used to kill Claudius in the end, they set about killing him. Now, where did they do this? They did this at a very public event, a dinner at their house, and there were guests everywhere. Many historical figures say it was quite a big event with plenty of guests. Due to its big event, Britannicus was invited. As he was a kid, they weren't really invited to the small set events, only the really big ones where they wanted to show face and show the whole family there. How they chose to administrate the poison was actually quite cunning. When Britannicus was served his wine, it was too hot, and the food taster first tasted and he was fine, and then it was given Britannicus, and Britannicus drank it, but it was too hot for him to drink. So he ordered for it to be taken away and to add cold water to it, which was common practice for mulled wine if it was too hot. But what they added was not actually cold water, it was pure nightshade. Enough nightshade is believed to have killed at least 3 people. We know this because of what it did to his skin tone, that I'll explain very soon. So, the nightshade is put into his drink and given back to him. He had a few drinks of this deadly nightshade, and due to its high quantity, he quickly froze up. Britannicus immediately suffered the effects, Tacitus stating that the boy immediately lost both life and breath. This is when Nero used Britannicus' illness to his advantage, stating to the crowd that there's nothing to worry about, and they were immediately just going to move Britannicus to a different room where he can have his seizure. This meant the people in the audience were not really very concerned with Britannicus, and therefore continued with their night. When Britannicus was brought to another room and left there alone, he sadly passed away. They didn't waste very long in burying Britannicus. Due to the fact of the high dosage of poison, it's believed it could turn his skin either red or blue. To avoid this, they had his funeral that very night, something that was so rare back then, and as he was considered to be a potential heir, as well as a key member of the royal family, it would normally take at least a week to hold proceedings for his funeral. But they buried him that night, and they covered his face in white chalk. This is to color the colours of his skin of either being red or blue. But this plan didn't work entirely to their favour, as when they held the funeral that night outside, it started pouring with rain. many people stating in the sources that they believe it was revenge for the gods of his murder. And the rain washed away the white chalk, and many of the viewers of the funeral saw his ghastly skin that was either a vibrant blue or red, showing the signs of poisoning. After his funeral, there was nothing stopping Nero to ascend to the throne, as he was now officially the only proper heir to the throne. Agrippina and Nero were happy with Locusta, as there was no longer a clear enemy to their power on the throne, and no longer a key competitor to their hold on the throne. After this, Locusta was arrested quickly but once again pardoned by Nero. In this time period, she was awarded with so many riches from Nero, as Nero was so impressed with her poison making and still required of her deadly services, as he was quite well known for loving deadly and odd deaths. After her release from prison, Emperor Nero awarded her with many estates and riches. He even granted her her own school where she could teach pupils her art in poison making, as Nero hoped he could create an army of mini poison makers to get rid of all his competitors. During this time, Nero sent her slaves, animals, and convicts to test her poisons on, and it's even believed Locusta came up with a few of his torture methods that he's quite known in history for, with even one or two historians crediting her with potentially coming up with dipping Christians in wax and making them into candles. Only one or two historians really came up with that, and it's not really any links to actual evidence. It's more just theorization. So I wouldn't go as far to give her the blame for that one yet, but I thought it was interesting that some historians even credited her with that idea. It's during this time period it's believed Locusta could have killed thousands of people, especially considering all her pupils were testing the poisons as well. This would make her one of the most prolific serial killers throughout all of history, and including her pupils, she would have ended the lives of thousands of people. But we'll never truly know the numbers, as many of them were slaves and convicts that weren't even given the dignity of having a funeral or a documentation of their death. If she did kill all these people in cold blood, and this is correct, this would make her as one of the most successful serial killers throughout all of our history. For Locusta, all good things must come to an end, and for her that was in 68 when Nero committed suicide. For Nero, the world around him was crashing, as the people and the Senate were both turning against him. His erratic and evil behaviour had made him not only gone down in history as one of the worst emperors now, but back in the time period people strongly disliked him, and the mob was slowly circling his estate, leading to him to either commit suicide or die via mob, and he made his choice. But in this choice he also doomed many of his closest associates, Locusta included. As soon as Nero committed suicide, Locusta probably would have known her time has come, as she, as well as many of Nero's close associates, were ordered to be seized by Galba, the new emperor. Once Locusta was seized and all of her state taken to be given to Galba, she was walked through the city of Rome in chains to be executed. As she was dragged to the city, Cassius Dio named her the scum that come to the surface during Nero's days, and Emperor Galba was promising for this to be an end of the story situation, and Locusta and people like Locusta will never rule power again. For all those that are interested and would like to hear about her death, I will not be talking about the death that involves a very large mammal. It's highly believed to not be true. There's all the information that tells the story of this happening to Locusta came hundreds of years after her death. Also, it'd be the only time in history that happened, and many historians, people believe, me included, that this information was only created to further ruin the legacy of Locusta, similar to how they did to Catherine the Great with the death of the horse. Now, it is probably what happened is, like many other criminals in the time period, she was dragged to the city in chains and promptly executed, and her body thrown into the Tiber, like many criminals of the time period. The Tiber was a big river where many criminals were thrown in and not given a proper funeral, and this was most likely what happened to Locusta during her time period. Now, why did Locusta do this? Many historians have multiple different theories, but what comes up the most is revenge. Now, Locusta of Gaul was Gaulish, which at the time was a territory of Rome, and during this time period many slaves were taken, and most historians believe Locusta herself was a slave. It would make a lot of sense for Locusta to have been a slave taken from Gaul to serve in Rome, until her skills with herbalism was quickly noted and they decided to use her skills to their advantage. It'd be perfectly understandable that a Gaulish slave who was taken to an unknown country and forced to work, along with many of her fellow people, many whom would quickly die on the walk because they weren't really given carriages to walk through, they were forced to walk, and if one fell down, they'll quickly be killed. This practice was actually was noted to help inspire Hitler for the death marches in Nazi Germany. So this is the kind of treatment the Gaulish people were given. It would make perfect sense for Locusta to feel vengeance towards people of Rome. The people that had not only terrorized her village, killed multiple, if not thousands of hundreds of thousands of her own civilians, and forced her to be a slave, it would make sense that she would have a lot of vengeance for the people that did this to her. And it'd make a lot of sense for her to want to get this revenge, and she probably used her skills with poison making to get this revenge. It makes a lot of sense that she would not feel empathy towards those that she kills if she just views them as the same people that terrorized her community and terrorizes her family and her country. It wasn't uncommon for Gaulish people to feel that Gaul should be separated from Rome and no longer under their control, as they were taken by force during the reign of Julius Caesar and the early years of Augustus. This is why many historians believe that Locusta's motives were of personal revenge. And this is what most historians believe. A desire and a yearning to wreak havoc on those that conquered her and the people she cared about. And this would explain why she felt no empathy for those she hurt. Locusta would have had the means. She had the knowledge of herbs, she had the knowledge of poisons, and she had the ability to get revenge on those that hurt the community around her, and she probably took that. And so that's why many historians believe that the reason why Locusta was a poison maker was her personal vengeance. Now this is a reason but not an excuse. Of course, no reason why you should commit mass murder on a whole civilian group of people, but you also have to recognize the fact that if Locusta didn't use her poison abilities, she would have been a slave. And if Locusta didn't create those poisons for Nero, she would have been killed. If you look at her through that lens, she's a lot more empathetic. But this also doesn't explain why she killed so many hundreds once she was a teacher. And this also doesn't explain why she chose to take poisoning up instead of herbalism to cure people. Her poisoning does grant more money and more prestige, and it allows more power. So while it does give an empathetic lens, it is no reason or excuse to why she killed so many people. It's a fitting act of personal revenge for a Gaulish slave to want revenge on those people that harmed her. And she had the means, she had the talent, she had the skill set, and as many historians believe that she chose to take these abilities and use them to get exact revenge on the people around her. I hope this gives a good insight into Locusta of Gaul, not only her actions and what she did, but why she may have done them. And I really hope you enjoy this video, and thank you so much for watching, and please continue watching my videos if you'd like to learn more. I have some upcoming videos on like Agrippina and Nero, so if you'd like to hear more about the people in this video, please look out for them. And thank you so much for watching.